Hey everybody, it's Chris Iverson. I just want to talk about the Trump disqualification case. I've been posting about it, and you guys can respond to this video, and I'll probably respond to your comments. Let's start with the text of the Constitution that's at issue here. So the text says, this is the 14th Amendment, Section 3. Just a little context, the Civil War had just happened, and the North, who now is in control of the government after the loss of hundreds of thousands of American lives, said, okay, well, we don't want the Confederacy people to take office and basically win the war by getting elected and taking over Congress and the presidency and getting their agenda enacted into law. So we have to stop them, the elite from the South, from taking office. Basically, that's what they were trying to stop. Understandably so. And at the same time, you see this interplay where they don't want them to take over, but they also kind of want to appease them because they're fellow Americans, and we got to kind of move on, and we can't keep fighting all the time over this stuff. And so they want to do appeasement to get everybody to kind of settle down and move on, but also they don't want them to take power. So what they did is they passed the 14th Amendment, and in Section 3 they talk about this disqualification piece to achieve that kind of purpose, that goal. So here's what it says. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president, or, this is the important part, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, but Congress, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, may remove such disability. Okay, so let's kind of go through this one piece at a time. So the first question is, what positions can somebody be disqualified from? What positions can somebody be disqualified from? So it says no person shall be a senator. Now Trump's not running for Senate, so that part's irrelevant. No person shall be a representative in Congress. Of course, he's not running for Congress. They can't be an elector of president or vice president. Trump's not running he's not trying to be an elector. An elector is somebody who, after states vote in a general election, they're the ones who then go to who submit their votes, and they say, people voted for Trump, or they voted for DeSantis, or whoever they voted for, and this is the kind of the elector vote, and then Congress counts the electoral vote. That's a whole electoral college thing. Anyway, the point is, Trump's not trying to be an elector, so that part's not really relevant here. But here's the next part. No person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. Okay, so that's really the question. Is Trump trying to hold, quote, any office, civil or military, under the United States? All right, so when you first look at this, you think what I thought, which was, that's weird. It doesn't say president. It says senator, representative, elector, or office. It's odd to specify senator and representative, but not specify the president. You think they would call it out. And so it makes you think that, any office is smaller. Also, if you look at the order that it's written, senator is a big deal, or representative is not as big of a deal. Elector is not as big of a deal, and then it goes down to office. So it looks like it's going down in importance. That's one way to read it. The other way to read it is that a senator is not an office. A senator is a member of Congress in constitutional language. Representative is a member, elector is a member of the Electoral College. But office is a separate thing. Office and officers are a separate kind of a thing. So now it's like we're transitioning to a different kind of position. We're going into office type of thing, right? And then it says or any state having or any state. So the first question is whether or not the presidency is an office. And it is an office, and lots of different places in the Constitution it talks about the office of the presidency. So I think that can be reasonably interpreted as an office. Also, there's a disqualification for president for impeachment. So if somebody is impeached and removed, now Trump was impeached, but he wasn't removed. But if you're impeached and removed, you can't be president again. And the language in that part of the Constitution just refers to, you can't hold a high office. if you've been impeached and removed. And everybody interprets that as if you're president and you've been impeached and removed, you can't come back and be president again, and it just uses the word office. So I think office can be reasonably interpreted to include the presidency there. So I don't think that's a barrier from disqualifying Trump under this section. But there's more to the section. So the next part of it goes, who having previously taken an oath. So you can't just be, it's not just anybody who did an insurrection. Lots of people can do an insurrection and then they can hold office. This does not disqualify most people who could possibly do an insurrection from then holding office. You have to have done an insurrection, and you have to have previously taken an oath. Previous to the insurrection, having previously taken an oath. As a member of Congress. Now, Trump was never a member of Congress. He was never a member of Congress. Or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States. This is the strongest part of Trump's case, in my opinion, because, yes, he took an oath when he, first of all, the only position Trump's ever had, government position Trump's ever had that I'm aware of, is President of the United States. He was never a senator or representative or anything like that. He was like a cadet captain in like a military school thing, but that doesn't count. That's not an officer. That's not military, and anyway, it doesn't matter. All that really matters here is that he was a president before. And so the question is that an officer of the United States? Now, this is weird, right? Because we're calling the presidency an office. So you would think the person who holds the office would be an officer, but that is not how the Constitution typically works. Really, everywhere else, the president appoints the officers. Well, the president doesn't appoint himself, and there's a lot of things in constitutional cases where the presidency is not an officer. So how did the Colorado Supreme Court? The Colorado Supreme Court said Trump's disqualified. How did they get around this? They had to wrestle with this also, and they basically said it's an absurd interpretation of this provision of the Constitution to say the word officer has to strictly mean what it means everywhere else in the Constitution, because there is no way that they thought when they passed this amendment that you can be an insurrectionary president and then run for president again. Like, that is not clear. It's clearly not what they meant to do. Well, it might not be what they meant to do, but it is what they wrote, right? And so that's the difficulty. I mean, I agree. It's an absurd outcome. It's a totally absurd outcome. But can the Constitution have absurd outcomes? Is Congress forbidden to have absurd outcomes? No, they're not forbidden from having absurd outcomes. But there is a thing about, like, when you read the Constitution, you're not supposed to read it to have absurdities in it. You're supposed to read it to make it all kind of work together. So there's that kind of canon of construction or whatever as they call it. So that's a difficult one. I think that can go 50-50. They could read the word officer here as meaning something different than the rest of the Constitution, because that's clearly the thrust and purpose and all that of this section. But, if you're Neil Gorsuch and you're a strict constructionist and ice runs through your veins and the text says what it says, yeah, you might say that Trump wasn't an officer, so this disqualification provision doesn't apply. So that is the hardest part of this case, in my opinion, and that's also what you see from the really smart lawyers. They zero in on this word officer a lot. Okay, and then the next part is so first you have what offices or positions you could be potentially disqualified from, and then you have this. By the way, you have to have taken an oath as the appropriate kind of position, and then you have what conduct do you have to have engaged in order to be disqualified. And the conduct is, it says, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Okay, so, all right, so here we have just a number of questions. So the first question is, was there an insurrection? Was there an insurrection? And in order to determine that, we have to ask ourselves, how do you define insurrection? How do you define that? So the definitions from the time. Now, at first you hear insurrection, it sounds like a really dangerous word. It sounds like it had to be like a coup, like they were trying to take over the government and all that kind of stuff, right? And it was written in the context of post-Civil War, so I'm sure the Civil War was on the brain. But, they could have written if somebody tries to, commit war against the government, or if they, they could have used stronger language than insurrection or rebellion. There's a lot of words you can choose. They chose these words, so we have to figure out what those words mean. And contemporary definitions at the time indicate that what it includes is there's got to be violence to have an insurrection. There's got to be a large group of people, a significant group of people. It can't be like one guy, right? It's got to be a group. And then their purpose for their violence, because you can have riots, you have the LA riots and all, it's lots of riots. But they have to have a purpose of trying to stop a significant government function, not any government function, not like they're blocking the street, which is preventing the flow of traffic, which is something the government has purview over, so it's an insurrection. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's not an insurrection. They're blocking the street. They should be arrested because it's frustrating. They shouldn't be blocking the streets, but it's not an insurrection. So an insurrection, it's got to be a major government function. And it turns out that what happened on January 6th does kind of meet that definition. I mean, you've got a large group of people. I think there's been 800 people or whatever now who have been charged and either convicted or they've pled out. Some of them have pled out to or been convicted of seditious conspiracy. Seditious. That's pretty strong language there. And I haven't followed all the cases, so I don't know. I do think there's certainly a possibility that some of these people just really shouldn't have been prosecuted, just kind of unreasonable. So I'm not saying that all the prosecutions are reasonable, and I think the next time we get a Republican president, they should take a close look at that. And if anybody people who weren't violent or didn't do something really bad, probably should just be commuted their sentence and let them go, or pardon them or whatever, and let them go. But yeah, people who committed violence, I wouldn't let them go. So there's a bunch of violence now. There's a bunch of people, and there's over last thing I saw was there was 140 police officers who reported injuries, and some of these injuries are like traumatic brain injury, and like the spinal cord was crushed or whatever, spinal discs or whatever. Some guy, one person with the knee. I mean, I've seen videos of people being crushed and trampled on, and there's like J6ers showing up in tactical gear with shields and like a weapon and all that stuff. Now, I guess there were some firearms, but I mean, people weren't like shooting and all that kind of stuff very much. So it wasn't that kind of thing. So there's two ways to look at whether or not this was an insurrection. One way to look at it is, does it meet the elements of an insurrection? And that's kind of the way I look at it. Does it technically meet those elements? And the answer is yes. I mean, the vice president had to flee. Our elected representatives had to flee. It broke through the Capitol Police, of which there were hundreds. I mean, I don't know how many Capitol Police there were, but if 140 were injured, there were a lot of Capitol Police. To overcome 140 police officers at the Capitol, you have to have a significant amount of force that you're using, and to break through and get our people to flee, our representatives to flee, that's a lot of force. That's a lot of force. The U.S. government doesn't just let anybody come in and force our reps to flee. So that's a significant amount of force. But there is an intuition by people who are Trump supporters to say, well, how much force was this really? I mean, yes, okay, yeah, I guess they fled and everything, but there were no machine guns. This wasn't like a Navy SEAL planned out operation with really intelligent people and all that kind of stuff. And plus, how many FBI informants were there? People have concerns about some of those kind of things as being reducing the culpability of the J6ers and or even Trump potentially. So there's those kinds of concerns. But I think overall, if you look at here's the thing with the FBI people. Okay, yes, there might be some FBI people there. I am not aware of the FBI causing 140 police officers with injuries. I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of them, striking and crushing and harming and hitting police officers. I don't think they did that. I'm not aware of it, at least. And I think that would be a pretty astounding claim to say that the FBI harmed 140 police officers. I don't think that happened. Now, suppose they tried to encourage J6ers to commit violence. Right? That might be an argument against criminal prosecution because it's an entrapment by the FBI. That potentially could be a defense. But that does not mean it was not, that what occurred there wasn't an insurrection. And it doesn't mean that, maybe the FBI has some blame for that. But that doesn't mean that other people didn't also commit insurrection. So, two things can be true at once. Just because the FBI acted potentially in an irresponsible way. And I'm not making a judgment one way or another because I don't know, but I'm just saying it doesn't matter. Like, that's a red herring. If the FBI was around and was encouraging things, that doesn't mean that the J6ers didn't do what they did, and that doesn't mean that Trump is or isn't disqualified. Like, it's an irrelevancy with regards to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. That's my point there. And again, I just don't have enough facts to know. I'll hear our allegations. I don't know, and I don't think anybody who makes those allegations knows, to be totally honest, either. So the other thing I want to mention is, so that's whether or not there was an insurrection, and I think the answer to that is yes. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks that. 57% of the Senate thought that. They voted that way, and there's a bunch of senators actually who didn't vote to remove Trump after he was impeached. But if you listen to what they said, a decent amount of Republicans kind of thought January 6th was kind of an insurrection, but they didn't vote to remove Trump for like technical reasons. They thought, well, he's already out of office, so you can't impeach and remove. That was their technical reason for not voting for it. It's not that they didn't think that there wasn't an insurrection. So a very high majority, I would say, of the Senate thought that was an insurrection, and 54% of the House voted that way. And the Colorado Supreme Court thinks it's an insurrection, and the Colorado District Court thinks it's an insurrection. And then there's a New Mexico court that disqualified a guy from holding office in New Mexico because they said he did an insurrection, and it's under the same amendment here that they disqualified that guy. So it's a New Mexico court, and as far as I'm aware, no court has said that there wasn't an insurrection. The courts that have dismissed cases related to this so far dismiss them on like procedural grounds. You don't have standing or whatever the case is. But it's not because they said, I'm not aware of any court saying that there was not an insurrection. So every time somebody has gone to do fact finding on this in any kind of an official way, all of them have affirmed, yes, there's an insurrection. All of them. The Senate, the House, the Colorado courts, New Mexico courts. And nobody has said it's not an insurrection. So, that's kind of pushing one direction. And you look at the amicus briefs and the briefs at the courts and things, the Trump lawyers, the Colorado GOP and stuff, they're not really pushing very hard that it wasn't an insurrection. They mention it, but they know that's not the core of their case, and they're probably not going to win on that kind of claim because they all know it meets the elements. That part is kind of open and shut, to be totally honest, whether or not there was an insurrection, technically. Now, did Trump engage in the insurrection? That's another part. Maybe there was an insurrection, but maybe Trump's actions didn't amount to engaging in an insurrection. And I think here there's a little confusion. I think people think in order for Trump to be engaging in the insurrection, he must have been planning it. He must have been intending a bunch of violence from the outset. And that is not really required. A protest can turn into a riot, which can turn into an insurrection. I'll give you an example. I believe it was in Portland. There was a federal court building that was no longer usable because of, protesters, Antifa, whoever they were. I don't know. But they made it basically unusable, the federal court building, as I recall. When the protests first started, people weren't intending, to shut down the federal court building. But eventually things grew and developed, and that was over months, but grew and developed and everything, and to the point where this federal court building, now you can't use it. Now you could argue, I think pretty strongly actually, that was kind of an insurrection. There was violence used to maintain kind of control over that territory by the protesters, which is totally wrong. And so those people would be disqualified from office if they would ever even run for office. But and so in my opinion, I think that's insurrectionary. But just because they didn't plan it at first or whatever, they weren't intending that at first, that doesn't mean that, it couldn't have been an insurrection. So it's something can go from a protest to a riot to an insurrection, and it doesn't have to be planned out. Things can just kind of develop, kind of regress that in that direction, and then you can be involved in it. You can be engaging in it. You can have aided and comforted it, even if you did it kind of at the front end and it kind of developed into that. And so that's what we kind of see more with Trump. People say, well, he didn't, he could have sent in the military if he really wanted to do an insurrection. And if conservatives really wanted an insurrection, we would make one happen, or whatever. I've heard these kind of comments. Okay, but that's not what the claim is. The claim is not that this was like an organized, planned out, whatever thing. It was Trump got people all riled up. He brought them to the Capitol. He knew they were upset. He allegedly didn't want the Secret Service to take away their weapons, which is suspect, because he said, well, they're not going to hurt me. Well, who do you think they are going to hurt? The normal practice is to take away your weapons by the Secret Service if you're going to go look at, go to a rally of the president. Anyway, so and then he points him to go over to the Capitol. I understand the fighting started before he pointed him over, but the people who ended up doing the violence, they needed a big crowd like that to help get everything mobilized and to attack the Capitol. They needed a big crowd to do that. And without Trump, you're not getting the big crowd. I mean, he is necessary for all of that went down to have gone down. He is necessary. He's got to get everybody riled up, have them focused on one enemy, or one process or whatever. Pence was kind of the enemy, but also like the whole process. Get them all riled up about that. He's got to gather the people there, send them over to the Capitol. He said, I'm going to go with you, but then he didn't go with them and whatever. But and then he waited 3 hours before he told them to go home, at which time his followers went home, right? So when he told them to go home, they went home. So he told them to show up, he told them to go over, and he told them to go home, and they listened to him on all three of those things. He looks like the leader of this group. They're holding flags with his name on it. I mean, he looks like the leader of a group, and if that group committed insurrection, he looks like the leader of the group. Now you could say, well, they disobeyed what he wanted because he said peacefully. Yeah, okay. The problem is that doesn't really work if the claim is that you're sending people over and you kind of want the violence to happen, or you're kind of tolerant with the violence to happen, and you go, and you throw out the word peacefully. That the word peacefully doesn't absolve you of the rest of it. That doesn't really work. And also, while the violence was happening, he tweeted out, Mike Pence didn't do what should have been done, which any normal person would know is going to incite an already upset crowd to keep doing what they're doing and keep getting upset. And they were announcing it on bullhorns at the riot that was there. And by the way, people say, well, it wasn't an insurrection, it was a riot. There's no reason why a riot can't, some riots are an insurrection. Some insurrections are a riot, some insurrections are not. It's a Venn diagram, to quote Kamala Harris. Just because it's a riot doesn't mean it's not an insurrection. Those are not mutually exclusive things. On this point, also people will say, well, Trump's not been charged or convicted of insurrection or rebellion. Now, let's talk about the charge and conviction. This is an amendment to the Constitution. It is a disqualification. Okay, so it is not saying it's not a crime. Now, I understand insurrection. There are federal laws that make insurrection a crime, as there should be. But that is not what is being focused on here. This amendment does not say if somebody has been convicted of insurrection or rebellion or aid or comfort. It doesn't say that. It says engaged in or aided or comforted. It doesn't say convicted of. So you don't have to be convicted of. In fact, all of the Confederates that were disqualified from office under this provision, all of them who were disqualified here, none of those people were convicted. None of them. There is absolutely no precedent that says you've got to be convicted. The precedent says you do not have to be convicted of it. And there's a good reason why Congress would want to do that. Congress wanted to have this provision in here because they wanted to not have to convict all of the elites of the South, because it's going to just make people upset. They could have run trials 24/7 and be convicting everybody who ever wore a uniform in the South, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to appease the South. Let's move on. We're one country. We're brothers. Let's brothers and sisters, and let's have a country again, right? But we don't want you to hold office because we're a little nervous about that. So that was what they were trying to do. They didn't want to have to convict everybody. Also, they wanted a lower standard. You don't want to have beyond a reasonable doubt, because any little technicality can get somebody off on that. But this is in here as a disqualification, so it's going to be more like preponderance of the evidence. The question is, did you or did you not engage? Yes or no? That's the question here. Did you or did you not give aid or comfort? So it's a lower standard, so it's easier to disqualify people, and that's what they wanted here. Now, this is not the only disqualification in the Constitution. If you're not, 35 or older, you can't be president. If you're not a natural-born citizen, you can't be president. If you've already served 2 terms, you can't be president again. So we have other things. If you haven't been in the country for 14 years, you can't be president again. So you have to have all these different things, and this is just another one of those. And so the question is, are you qualified or not? Now, I agree. How old you are, natural-born citizen, those things are, 2 terms. Those things are easier to adjudicate. It's pretty easy to figure out how old you are, for the most part, most cases. you might have to have a case. You might have to have a little evidentiary hearing to try to figure out how old are you anyway, right? And what's the evidence? And are you a natural born citizen? And maybe your birth was kind of an unusual circumstance. They were U.S. citizens, but maybe they lost their citizenship before they had you, and you were in Canada, or I don't know, some weird concoction, and that may or may not make you a natural born citizen under the law, and so they have to have a court hearing to try to figure that out. It could be a little complicated. How would you figure it out? Well, you wouldn't have a criminal trial. You don't need a criminal trial. You would have a civil trial. And the same thing here. This is a disqualification. You have a civil trial to do a fact finding. Did you engage in insurrection or not? And then people will say, well, but that deprives Trump of his due process. And I don't think that's true, because the due process clause of the Constitution talks about, like, you're supposed to now, and by the way, there is a due process because it's a civil court proceeding, so there is due process. It's not the same due process as a criminal court proceeding, but there is due process. But as far as due process from a criminal court proceeding, the reason why we have the due process clause and all of those protections is if somebody's going to be deprived of life or liberty, then they have to have that level of due process. The presidency is not we're not taking your life if you're disqualified. We're not taking your liberty. You don't own the presidency, so we're not taking anything from you. We're saying whether or not you're qualified or not. It's like if somebody puts out a application for people, and they say we want people to apply for this job. Okay, what are the qualifications for the job? Well, you got to have this degree, you have to have this experience, whatever. You're not being deprived of anything by not getting the job, by not being found qualified for the job. And so this is like a qualification for the job. Did you engage in insurrection? Oh, I'm sorry, you're not qualified. We're not taking anything away from you. And so we're just stating that you're not qualified. In that sense. And so therefore, it's not the same due process problem. In addition to that, the 14th Amendment is in the Constitution, and it came after the due process clause of the Constitution. So to the extent that there is some conflict there, see, this is not like a law. This is a disqualification in the Constitution. So the due process clause is not going to constrain the 14th Amendment. That's the other part of this people don't remember. And then people will also say, like, the First Amendment. Well, he was just all the actions he took were covered under the First Amendment. He gathered people, right to assembly. He spoke, right to free speech, and they would claim that he did not incite people. And even if that's true, and there's a debate about that, but even if that's true under the Brandenburg case, that he didn't incite anybody, doesn't matter, because the First Amendment doesn't protect you from the 14th Amendment, right? This is a question of whether or not you engaged. It's not a question about committing a crime or whatever. And the First Amendment prevents you from laws Congress passes, but this is an amendment. And so those legal distinctions are necessary. And this is, by the way, these are all of the nuances that are not being covered on any news station because it's not interesting, right? But it is really important. I mean, it's really important. We're talking about the presidency of the United States. These legal distinctions are very important, and the TV lawyers aren't doing it because they know they're not going to have enough time to explain all this. People aren't going to understand it anyway, so they just say whatever, put on some makeup and say some talking points, and that's it. But all these little distinctions are extremely important for us to know. And then the last line is that Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such a disability, which they're not going to do. Some other objections are that this was only for the Civil War, but of course it doesn't say that here in the amendment. They could have passed it and said if you engage in insurrection of the Civil War, then you're disqualified. But of course they didn't say that. They said insurrection or rebellion, and there was talk at the time about focusing just on the Civil War, and they decided not to do that. They wanted a more expansive principle in our Constitution. That's what they passed. So that's a disqualification case. Really, the only question that is left here, there's one other thing about the 20th Amendment, but that's really kind of an aside. That's not going anywhere. And people will say, well, fine, we'll just disqualify Biden for equivalent conduct. Okay, well, if you can show that he engaged in an insurrection, go for it. The closest you're going to get, the border thing is not that. That's a policy difference. That's not an insurrection. The closest you're going to get, what government function is being blocked by people coming across the border? None. It's just a policy. It's a prosecutorial discretion kind of a thing, or how much resources are you going to spend on this policy versus that policy? Do I think he's wrong for the border? Of course he's wrong. Everybody knows he's wrong. You have to be like a complete lefty to think he's right on the border. But policy disagreement is not an insurrection. That's ridiculous. But what it would be, arguably, was to the extent that Biden and Kamala engaged or gave aid and comfort or whatever, if they did sufficiently for some of the protests that we saw, and you can connect some of those protests to stopping major government functions, you might be able to draw a line. You have to really show that the connection was close. Like in this case, Trump got everybody riled up, told them, hey, it's going to be wild, you got to come out for J6, and then he had the rally right there, and then he pointed them to the Capitol, and they went to the Capitol, and then for 3 hours he doesn't tell them to go home, even though Hannity's calling them, and Don Jr.'s calling them, and Scavino's calling them, and they're all telling him, hey, you got to tell these people to go home. This is crazy. There's smoke coming out of the Capitol. This is going to be your legacy. What are you doing? You got to call it off. And he's just like, no, leave me alone, leave me alone. Maybe I'll send a tweet here or there. I'm going to, eat my soup and watch it on, or whatever he's eating, and watch it on Fox News as it's all going down. Oh, Mike Pence had to be escorted away. And he goes, so what? As what was, people have said, Trump said, and they were under oath when they made that claim. It was Scavino. Oh, I think Trump and him are still friends. It's just it's a very bad look. It's a very bad look. But if you're going to argue that Trump is not disqualified, you should really take the what's his name, Professor Josh Blackman. Oh, he's very smart. You should take his. He thinks Trump's not disqualified. He's a very smart guy, and he focuses on the word officer because that's the only case that's left. It's not whether or not there was an insurrection. There was. It wasn't whether or not he engaged. He did. It's not whether or not the presidency is an office. It is. It's just whether or not Trump ever took an oath as an officer to support the Constitution. And on that, you might have a technical win. It's an absurd conclusion, but it might be a technical win. So that's the only argument that you've got, and that might be what the Supreme Court decides. Then we'll see. They're going to hear the case on February 8th. It's a very important case, and we'll see how the Supreme Court turns out. So I hope that explains my view for everybody. Talk to you later. Bye.